ever watched a heist movie? Please, you're a Capers and Cocktails listener. Of course you have. Have you seen the scenes where the thieves are meticulously planning the heist, or practicing their moves, or using replica vaults to get good at their safe cracking? Well, what you might not realize is that these classic scenes are inspired by the king of bank robbers, the architect of larceny himself, George Leonidas Leslie. Welcome to Capers and Cocktails, a true crime podcast that doesn't take itself too seriously and gives you something to enjoy while you listen. The following content may be disturbing to some. Discretion is advised. If you're enjoying one of our themed cocktails, ensure you're of legal drinking age and have fun, but drink responsibly. George Leonidas Leslie was born in 1842 in Cincinnati, Ohio. His father was a successful beer tycoon, which means he's all the more reason a perfect subject for Capers and Cocktails. It also meant that his family was super wealthy. George was an honors student in college, studying architecture at the University of Cincinnati. One of the only stories that I could find from that time in his life was that though he was the college's sharpshooting champion, he did not care much for the title because he didn't like guns. Because of that, maybe, or because he was rich, when George was 21, his dad bought him out of the draft for $300 or $7,400 2024 dollars. Honestly, that seems like kind of a small price to pay. At the time, the Union Conscription Act of 1863 called for all able-bodied males between 20 and 40 to be drafted into service for the Union Army, and Cincinnati was a hub for gathering Union Army troops. While it wasn't illegal and arguably a very smart decision, George's dad's move to save his son's life was a massively unpopular move. Draft dodgers at the time were considered worse than deserters, and so George, well, he lost all of his friends. He was ostracized by many friends and also some family, and the resentment overwhelmed him. A young college student that just didn't like guns and didn't want to die in the War of Rebellion, even if it was for the right side. After he graduated, George got engaged to Sarah Lawrence, a socialite in her own right, but her father had only reluctantly agreed to the marriage, since he was a Union Army veteran and a Republican. George started a company that was contracted to provide shovels for the construction of America's first transcontinental railroad, so things were starting to look up in the world of George Leonidas Leslie. What a middle name, Leonidas. Brilliant. Well, things quickly plummeted for George Leonidas when Ohioan and Union Army war hero Jacob Parrott returned to Cincinnati in May 1867, and within months, Sarah had run off to marry him instead of George. That same year, George's parents died, and so, to escape the draft dodger stigma and start a new life, George sold the family home, closed his shovel business and the beer business, and moved to New York City. He was 27 and primed for adventure. According to his biographer, J. North Conway, quote, "All the respectable things of the world, position, education, and wealth, didn't mean a thing to him anymore. They had all come easily to him and had ultimately gotten him nowhere. What he wanted now was what he'd never had in his life, mystery and adventure," end quote. Once he arrived in New York City, George moved into a room at the Fifth Avenue Hotel. After a dinner with some newfound New York socialite friends, George slipped the salt and pepper shakers from his table into his pocket. The rush he got was the inspiration for the remainder of his crime-filled life. Stealing salt and pepper shakers, my friends, that's a gateway drug. Be warned. Soon after, one of his new friends sent him an invitation to a private party held at 79 Clinton Street, the home of Frederica Marm Mandelbaum, who was the queen of all fences. Okay, y'all, now we've talked about this lady on a previous episode before, and when I hear someone's name twice, they are fixing to get their own episode. Today's repeat character is a one Frederica Marm Mandelbaum. Marm Mandelbaum was a formidable figure in the New York City underworld during the late 1800s. Known for her role as a criminal fence, she managed stolen goods worth between $1 and $5 million from 1862 to 1884. Beyond fencing, she financed and orchestrated numerous burglaries and other crimes, solidifying her influence in the post-Civil War era. Similar to her main rival, John D. Grady, Marm became a central matriarch in the city's illicit activities and was the fence for many important New York City criminals, including Adam Worth, or the Napoleon of Crime that we learned about in Season 3. At the time, New York City had a series of loosely knit gangs, including the gangs of Thomas Shang Draper, Johnny the Mick Walsh, and of course, Marm. George escalated from salt shakers to straight heists pretty quickly, if you ask me, and this guy used his smarts. Before committing a burglary, he would get a hold of the building's blueprints whenever possible. His degree in architecture enabled him to construct detailed scale models of his targets. Talk about using your college degree after you graduate, right? To gather further evidence, he might rent a safe deposit box or open an account at the bank, giving him a legal and natural reason to go to the building and study its layout and operations. Alternatively, he would have one of his men hired as a watchman or a porter to gain information. Once confident that the heist could be carried out without detection, George would choose his accomplices and walk them through the plan. He often recreated the target's interior in a separate room, or like in a warehouse, allowing his team, and yes, he got himself a team together, to rehearse the crime under his watchful eye. But if that didn't work, he was a smooth criminal of the highest degree and made close friends with corrupt police officers and politicians. And we know that right there always works. It always works. Once inside, he would get to work. You see, George owned models of numerous vaults and safes found across the United States. Before orchestrating a heist, he would identify the specific type of vault or safe used by his target. He then dedicated months to devising a method to open it without needing the combination. One of his ingenious tools was the little joker, a wired device inserted into a bank safe's lock beforehand. This device captured the lock's combination by recording dents and marks left by the tumblers over time. To use this tool, George would go to the targeted bank at least twice, once to place the device and again to get it back. By doing this, he would have the combination before executing the burglary. These skills, and frankly, operations of bank robberies and burglaries like a business, led George to be involved in 80% of the bank heists in the United States from 1869 to 1878. Unsurprisingly, he quickly gained the title of the King of Bank Robbers. George's most infamous crime, without a doubt, was the Ocean National Bank burglary. George and Marm were having a chat one evening, and George, feeling admiration and love for Marm, made her a big ol' promise. He promised her that he was going to pull off the highest-paying criminal heist in history. Talk about a guy stealing for that serotonin rush. Sheesh. He also believed it would be his real big initiation into the city's crime world. Marm spent $3,000 or $67,000 in modern spending power organizing a gang to rob the Ocean National Bank and put George in charge. You got to spend money to make money, right? She must have really believed in that salt and pepper shaker thief. George got to work making preparations for the biggest heist of his career that he scheduled for a weekend in June 1869, or at least he hoped. He spent 3 months training his gang, which included Billy Porter, Gilbert Yost, Jimmy Hope, Johnny Dobbs, Johnny Irving, and John Red Leary. Johnny I managed to snag a job as a cleaner, and Jimmy rented an office space in a basement right below the vault room, using a disguise, naturally. These were only a few parts of the massive amounts of preparation that George put into what was likely going to be the most important crime of his career. In fact, he planned it with more precision than any other bank burglary he'd ever done, and maybe more than most had ever done ever. The Ocean National Bank was located in the first 6 stories of a brownstone building on the corner of Greenwich and Fulton in what was then and is now the financial district of New York City. The office of the bank included a large business room, the president's private room, and the vault. The entrance to the vault was made up of 3 separate iron doors. On the Friday night of the weekend heist, Johnny I worked his cleaning job and opened the back door for the rest of the gang. They removed the dial from the safe, inserted the little joker inside, and then replaced the dial. When bank officials used the safe on Saturday the next day, the little joker recorded the combination stops on the lock. George had decided to wait 2 days to use the combination they got on the little joker because the bank kept more money in the bank over the weekend. On Sunday night, the gang forced open the 3 iron doors, and Johnny D removed the little joker, which, lucky for them, had not failed but done its one job, etching a series of notches into a tiny plate inside the dial. Johnny D, well practiced, quickly used those notches to guess the combination and popped open the safe. They pulled out handful after handful of cold hard cash, securities, and jewelry and carted it out of the building and into the seedy New York City underworld. The total haul was $768,879.74. In 2024, that would be $17.3 million. It was at the time by far the largest heist in New York City history. And I'll drink to that. There are a few different ideas about where the Manhattan cocktail originated. The most well-known version contends that Dr. Ian Marshall developed the recipe for a party that Winston Churchill's mother, Lady Randolph Churchill, threw at the Manhattan Club in New York City in the early 1880s. Many reject this tale, though, pointing out that Lady Randolph Churchill was pregnant and in England at the time. Small details. She wasn't partying in New York. Another theory holds that the drink was created in the famous Hoffman House in New York City by a guy going by the name of Black. Whichever version you accept, the Manhattan Club still has the formula. The Manhattan is still a common drink in bars, restaurants, and cafes all around the world today, and many people rank it among the greatest ever served. So let's make one of our own. To make the cocktail, put 2 parts whiskey, 2 parts sweet vermouth, and 3 dashes of bitter into a shaker with ice. Stir, do not shake. Strain over fresh ice and garnish with a cherry. Easy. For the mocktail version, add 2 parts non-alcoholic whiskey, 1 part grape juice, and 3 dashes of bitters into a shaker with ice and stirred, not shaken. Omit those bitters if you'd like, by the way. Strain over fresh ice and garnish with a cherry. Back in June 1869, Police Captain Thomas Bryns was put on the case. None of the detectives were able to uncover any leads. He had a little prickle about George, but he considered him a gentlemanly, educated architect socialite, so never really considered him a suspect. This belief would serve George well throughout his life. And then began a straight crime spree. And we're just going to go with the modern spending power because we are rapid firing this. Between November 21st and 22nd, 1869, George burglarized the Boylston National Bank in Boston, Massachusetts of upwards of $11 million. Between 12 and 1 a.m. on April 26, 1870, George burglarized the Auburn City Bank in Auburn, New York of $700,000. At 10 a.m. on August 1st, 1870, he, with a few others, burglarized the John Handley and Company Bank in Scranton, Pennsylvania of $680,000. Personal life break. George naturally was wealthy and therefore an extremely eligible bachelor. And after making Philadelphia his new criminal headquarters for a while, he met the daughter of the owner of the boarding house he was staying in. Mary Henrietta Koth, known as Molly, caught his eye, and following a short courtship, they got married. He was 28, she was 15. Color me shocked. Following their wedding, they moved to New York where they lived the life of a society couple. And while she didn't know about her husband's criminal activity for the beginning of their marriage, once she did find out, Molly was willing to overlook his criminal tendencies if it meant she could stay rich. Okay, back to the rapid fire. Y'all ready? In early August 1872, George and 6 of his gang burglarized the Trenton Bank in Trenton, New Jersey of about $560,000 modern dollars. Later that same month, on August 19th, 1872, George burglarized Third National Bank in Baltimore, Maryland of $5.6 million in stocks, bonds, and other valuables. Between 1 and 4 a.m. on October 14th, 1872, George and 9 of his closest friends stole $1.9 million from the Saratoga County National Bank in Waterford, New York. Are you getting sick of this yet? I didn't think so. In late January 1876, George masterminded a robbery at the Northampton Bank in Northampton, Massachusetts, for a $45,000 fee. And while he didn't participate physically in the crime, George's gang beat a bank cashier to give them the combination of the vault. After the robbery, George cut ties with the 2 leaders of that gang over their use of violence, which, as you can probably imagine from what you've heard so far, was not a part of his plan. The men who were engaged in that heist were eventually caught and prosecuted, but George, though implicated, was never convicted. Now, we all know that crime doesn't pay, and now we're getting to the part of our story where crime did not pay for our friend George Leonidas Leslie. In mid-February 1878, George's gang traveled to Dexter, Maine to rob the Dexter National Bank. George managed to get an inside man to help them with the job, James Wilson Barron. James had a great deal of animosity towards the bank for reasons he wouldn't share. On the night of February 23rd, the gang met up in the alley behind the bank and went to the side door. George had given them disguises from the Grand Opera House and shielded them from the street using a black theatrical screen, which prevented a police patrolman who walked by from seeing them. The group knocked on the side door several times, but James, who was supposed to let them in, did not respond, so a gang member busted it down. The gang ended up pistol whipping two-timer James, who told the gang that the vault was on a timer and couldn't be opened until the morning. George tried to stop them multiple times as the rest of the gang stole $500 from James's pocketbook and gagged him, wedging him between the vault's inner and outer doors. He would die an hour after he was found the next day. George was upset again with the use of violence. He wanted to use his brains to get what he wanted and to leave everyone physically unharmed. The rest of his gang of New York did not care and did not agree. After the botched and essential failed burglary turned robbery, George met with some of the violent gang members in a New York saloon. Things went quickly south, with one of the gang members saying that he didn't think it was fair that George always got the most of their heist loot, insisting that from now on they would divide the spoils equally. George, the literal mastermind of all the crimes, protested, leading to a dramatic threat to his life in the saloon, aka a pistol pointed directly at his chest. The gang member claimed the rest of the gang supported him. Talk about an awkward thing to overhear. Imagine if you were just there, like enjoying a beer after a long day of work and hearing these guys getting louder and louder and one of them pointing a gun and they're toppling over a table and it's just super, I don't know, awkward. Well, actually, that probably happened a lot in saloons in New York City in the late 19th century, now that I think about it. Just another day in the life. Marm would also warn George that the other members of the gang were dangers, and even though they followed her orders, she couldn't control them if their lives were in danger. She suggested that she should be in charge of the cuts of the heists, but George was not about that. George sold off his furniture and books from his New York home and spent late March and early April of 1878 constantly moving, never staying in one place for more than 2 nights. He eventually settled at a cottage in Brooklyn using a fake name, George Herbert. He also secured himself a bodyguard named Johnny Walsh. Johnny was a big old dude who had been to prison 100 times. Probably not. Anyway, he was apparently also suspected of 20 murders. He was known for being deadly with both a knife and his bare hands. In late April, George returned to Philadelphia to be with Molly. He told her he was retiring from the Revenue Service, a cover story to avoid revealing his real job. He told her that his work there had got him some dangerous enemies. And I guess people who work at the IRS probably do have some dangerous enemies. So even if Molly hadn't known about George's real job, she might have believed him. He told her he had one last task to complete in New York and would return in late May. George planned to take the money from one last big heist and move out west with Molly. But this would be the last time that he saw his wife. George had been making all the plans for a burglary of the Manhattan Savings Institution for over 3 years. He surveyed the bank multiple times. A replica of the bank was constructed in one of Marm's warehouses in Brooklyn, where he rehearsed the crime with his gang. He drew architectural plans of the interior and exterior of the bank and located and bribed a vault maker and learned how to duplicate the bank's safe's combination lock. George got his associate hired as a bank guard. But at the same time, George was making plans to do the whole heist by himself. Remember, he didn't trust the rest of the gang not to be violent with anyone, including himself. He contacted John Traveling Mike Grady, Marm's biggest rival, and Traveling Mike put together a gang for him. And that, as it turns out, would be his end. On the night of May 29th, 1878, George stopped at Murphy's Saloon in Brooklyn. Someone in the saloon delivered him an envelope. Inside was a letter containing the handwriting of a woman he was having an affair with. She said she would be waiting for him at her house on Halsey Street. George tore up the note and asked his bodyguard, Johnny, to hail him a cab. George told Johnny not to follow him and that he would be safe. George told the cab driver to go to Halsey Street, and Johnny watched him go. On June 4th, the body of George Leonidas Leslie was found at the foot of Tramps Rock in Mott's Woods, 3 miles from Yonkers. He had been shot once in the head and once in the heart. He was 41 years old. Resting on his body was a double-barreled pistol, which was later identified as the murder weapon. There was no identification found on the body, and his wallet, rings, and jewelry were taken. There were no bloodstains on his body, and his clothing had been meticulously placed. It suggested that he was murdered at another location and then transported to Tramp's Rock while hidden in a wagon's hay. Marm identified his body and paid for his funeral at Cypress Hills Cemetery in Brooklyn. After all the money and cred he earned her over the course of their relationship, she managed to find it in the goodness of her heart to pay $10 for him to be buried in a pauper's grave. Attending the funeral were several members of the gang that likely killed him. His wife, Molly, fainted and was carried out from the service. Marm's gang carried out the heist without him, using his planning, of course, and yielded $85.4 million 2024 dollars. So, posthumously and in a different crime, he did in fact keep his long ago promise to Marm. It was, even adjusting for inflation, the highest paying criminal heist in American history. Molly, George's young wife, returned to Philadelphia to live with her mother at the boarding house where she'd met George as a teenager. She died in October 1892 of consumption. She was 35 years old. George's death almost seems like an inevitability because of the circles he put himself in and the career he made for himself. But somehow, for a man who was able to get rich beyond his wildest dreams by using his intellect and not violence, it seems unfair that he met such a violent end. In obituaries, he was described as, quote, a man of refinement and culture, a skillful mechanic, end quote. He was buried in an unmarked grave under a false name of George Howard. Thanks for hanging out with me. How do you like these older episodes? I love hearing about heisters from days past. Makes history seem a little less, boring. And I was a history major in college. Well, if you liked the episodes this season, this is your friendly reminder that you'll help this podcast keep going and reach a bigger audience if you comment, like, share, and post a review. Consider it an early Christmas present. And I sure am thankful for all of you. Get it? And I'll see you next week. And remember, there are always alternatives to being the king of bank robberies. But if you're going to, you should quit while you're millions of dollars ahead, especially if you've made some serious